In this video, we'll look at how you can combine Google Forms with BuildShip to supercharge your forms to the next level. Google Forms is probably the easiest service that you can use to create forms and send forms in bulk to your users to collect valuable feedback. And you also get responses back in real time for you to analyze. But did you know that you can also send a Google form directly to your users' email inbox and have them fill out the form and submit it all without leaving their emailing application? Let's look at a quick demo. Here's a relatively short feedback form for a imaginary BuildShip workshop event. And you can see these are the fields that we are asking users to fill in. And when we're ready to send off our form, all we need to do is click send. And the important option to select here is to include form in email. And then we just need to enter the email address or addresses that we want to send our form to. I'll just enter Lewis@rowie.io, and then we'll send off the email. If I head into my inbox, you can see that I've received the form email here, BuildShip workshop feedback. And then you can see that this is the actual form embedded into Gmail, and it's actually interactive, meaning that I can fill out and submit the form all without having to leave Gmail. I'll now submit my own feedback for the workshop. We can now submit the form. We get a pop-up message telling us that we'll be submitting information to an external page. If we want to continue, we can confirm, so we'll select OK. And our feedback has been successfully submitted. If we go back to our Google form, we can actually see the responses we get back here. So this is a high-level overview of all the responses we get back from our form. But there's a lot more interesting stuff that we can do with these responses, and this is where the BuildShip integration comes into play. If you're not already familiar with BuildShip, BuildShip is a low-code visual backend builder that you can use to quickly create powerful APIs. And in fact, behind the scenes, this Google form is already wired up to a BuildShip workflow so that all responses will be forwarded to BuildShip, where we can choose to do with them whatever we want. For example, we have a workflow here that will be triggered whenever we receive a new response to our Google form. And what we're doing here is saving the entire response in the BuildShip database. And if we bring up our BuildShip database, all responses are being stored under the BuildShip feedback table. And here we can see our previous responses. And once we have this data stored, we can do anything we want with it. For example, if we want, we can create our own feedback assistant using BuildShip's powerful OpenAI assistant node so that we can query any information from our saved responses in natural language. Let's see that in demo. Here I'm sending a message to my assistant based on the feedback, which section needs the most to be improved. We can test this workflow. And then we get back a response from our assistant telling us that based on the feedback, the section that needs the most improvement is how satisfied were you with the logistics. It's telling us that we received multiple responses where the logistics were rated very poorly. And it's even giving us references from our stored responses. For the remainder of this video, we'll look at how you can quickly create a Google form from a template, how you can configure the form to connect with BuildShip, creating our feedback workflows from scratch, and finally, demoing form submission and our feedback assistant. Let's get started. Let's create our form. You'll notice that I'm already signed into my Google Forms account. And here we'll find a list of templates that we can use to quickly get started creating our form. There's even more that you can preview if you go to the template gallery, to the general tab, and as you can see, there's a lot more options to select from. But in this video, we want to create an event feedback form, so we'll select the event feedback template. This will create an event feedback form for us with some default questions. We can customize the appearance of this form pretty easily. For example, let's say that we want to change this cover image. We'll go to customize theme, and we'll remove the current header and then just upload our own. And that's updated. And we can further customize this form by adding more questions or removing existing questions. Let's scroll through the form to see which questions we may not need. Logistics sections seems a bit irrelevant for us, so we can remove this. At the bottom, just select delete. We also don't need this section for which session was most relevant, so we can delete this as well. And there's this additional feedback on logistics that we can also delete. And for the purposes of this demo, these are all the questions we need to have in our form. Once our form is created, we can start sending it out to our users to start collecting feedback. With Google Forms, that's super easy to do. All you have to do is click send. You can enter the email address or addresses you want to send your form to, the subject, the email message. And then the important part here is that we want our users to be able to fill out these forms without having to leave their emailing application. So you'll want to select include form in email. But as you'll remember, the primary goal of this video is to have responses forwarded to a BuildShip workflow. And in order to do that, we'll need to configure our form to start sending responses to said BuildShip workflow. And just so you know, we'll need to write a small amount of code to be able to connect our Google form to BuildShip. But don't worry, because we'll be using ChatGPT to guide us through all the steps. Now, I've went ahead and asked ChatGPT to help us connect our Google form to an external API endpoint. Eventually, we'll be getting this API endpoint from one of our BuildShip workflow that we will be publishing. But for now, we can follow the steps that we need to complete. Creating the Google form, we've already done this step. And next, we need to set up the script editor. Let's go back to our Google form, and then we can bring up the script editor. Let's go back to ChatGPT and see what we need to do next. So it's telling us in the script editor, we'll need to write a Google Apps script to handle the form submission and then send the data to an external API endpoint. But the cool thing is that it has also given us the code that we will need to use. So we can just copy this code, go back to the script editor and paste it here. This code includes two functions. The first one is a onFormSubmit, and this function it will be called whenever our form is submitted. And there's a couple of stuff that we're doing in here, but the main thing is that we're gathering all the responses, and then what we need to do is specify our API endpoint URL. And as we mentioned, this will eventually be our BuildShip workflow endpoint URL. And then once we do that, we want to submit all the responses to that API endpoint. We also have a secondary function at the bottom, create trigger, and this is necessary to create that initial trigger for our form. Before we move on to the other steps, you'll notice here that we have a placeholder as well for our form ID. We can easily get this value if we go back to our Google form. In the URL, we can copy the form ID and just paste that value here. We'll pause here and we'll switch over to BuildShip and start creating our initial workflow so that we can place our API endpoint URL here so that we can verify and test that responses are being sent to BuildShip. Here I am in BuildShip, and let's get started by creating our first workflow. But first, we'll create a folder because eventually we'll be having two workflows, one for saving the responses from Google Form, and then a second one for our feedback assistant. So we'll call this folder Google Forms Handler. And in this folder, we can start by creating our first BuildShip workflow. I would call this workflow Save Google Form Response. And create. Google Form will be making a post request to our BuildShip workflow, so we'll need to add a trigger, and the trigger we'll need to use is the REST API call trigger. First, let's change the HTTP method to post, and then we need to enter a endpoint path. So for this, we'll just say save form response. Great. The next thing we want to do in this workflow is save all the responses into our BuildShip database. And conveniently, BuildShip provides a node that we can use for doing that pretty easily. You can select the Create Document node, and this node will either create or update existing documents. Let's enter the table name. We'll call this Google Form Responses. And then we need to specify the data we want to save. We'll save all our responses as an object. So we'll say responses, and then our responses will be found in the body of the request. We can get that by going to variables, requests, body. And then the last thing we want to do in this workflow is simply return an OK status. For that, we'll use the return node, and the status is already set to OK. And that's all our workflow needs to do for now. Now let's ship our workflow. And with our workflow now deployed successfully, we can copy the endpoint URL, go back to the script editor of our form, and then for the API endpoint URL placeholder, we can paste in our workflow endpoint URL. And we're almost done with the app script setup. Let's go back to ChatGPT and see what are the other steps we need to do. So step 4 involves deploying the script. So first we'll want to save the script with a name. So let's do that. We'll call this form to BuildShip. Rename and then save. And that's done. The next set of instructions are for setting up the trigger. So it's telling us to click on the clock icon on the left sidebar. So let's do that. And then from here, we'll click add trigger. And then it's telling us to set the function to create trigger, deployment to head, event source to from form, and event type to on form submit. So let's see if those values are already set for us. So choose which function to run. We need to change this to create trigger. Choose which deployment should run, select head, the event source from form, and then for the event type, we want to select on form submit. And now we can save the trigger. If it's the first time you're doing this, you'll need to go through an authorization phase. I'll just select my Gmail account and I'll just allow. And our form trigger has been saved. Let's go back to ChatGPT and look at the other steps. So step 5 involves authorizing the script. We just did that. And step 6 is testing our form submission. We can now test if our form integration with BuildShip is working. Let's send the form. For the email address, I'll just enter my own email address. We can leave the subject set to event feedback and the message. And then the main thing we want to select here is include form in email. And then we can send off the email. If I go to my inbox, I'll see a new email here, event feedback. I can open this. And then here's a Google form directly embedded into the body of the email. And I can start filling out this form here. How satisfied were you with the event? I'll say very much. How relevant did you think it was for your job? Very much. What are your key takeaways from this event? BuildShip is awesome. How satisfied were you with the session content? Excellent. And then the last thing I'll do is just to enter my name here and I'll submit the form. At this point, if we did all the setup correctly, then our feedback should have been sent to our BuildShip workflow and saved. First, let's find out if our workflow was even called. We can do that by bringing up the logs, and we can see that our workflow was indeed invoked. We can further inspect the logs to view the body of the request, which should include our questions and answers from the form. So when we create the document, we submit an input, and the data contains the response, and the responses are all of the questions and answers that we filled out in our form. And you can see that all the information is here. That means that if we bring up our BuildShip database, we should have our response saved. Here's our Google Form responses table. We need to set it up. We can just click create, and then we'll want to import the existing data. The only column in this table is our responses column, so we can select this, continue, continue, and then continue, and finish. And here we'll find our Google Form response saved. Great. That means that our Google Form to BuildShip setup is working fine. Now let's send our form one more time, just so that we have more data to work with when we start creating our feedback assistant. I go back to my inbox and I get the email again. And here's the form, and I'll just quickly fill out this again, this time submitting a negative feedback. The feedback is now submitted. If we go back to our BuildShip table, we can see our new feedback here. The main idea that we're trying to get through at here is that once you have your responses stored in BuildShip, then you can do anything you want with those responses. For example, what we're going to be doing next is using BuildShip's OpenAI Assistant node so that we can quickly query any information we want about these responses in natural language. Let's create a new workflow, and we'll call this Chat with Google Form. We'll add a trigger, and we'll just select the REST API call trigger. For the path, we'll say chat with Google form. We can leave the HTTP method set to get, and then we'll go straight to adding our OpenAI assistant. The first thing we can do here is select our OpenAI API key. If you don't already have this saved in BuildShip, then you can retrieve this from your OpenAI dashboard and just create a new secret. And then we need to enter an assistant ID. For that, we'll be heading over to the OpenAI dashboard and we'll create a brand new assistant. And we'll call our assistant Google Form Feedback. From here, we can just ensure that the latest GPT model is selected. We don't need to enable any tools. That's all we really need to do. And we can just copy the assistant ID. We go back to BuildShip and paste that value here. Next, I'll just paste in the instructions for our assistant to follow. And here we're telling our assistant that it's a powerful feedback assistant for BuildShip. We're letting it know that it has access to all the feedback users submit about BuildShip and that it will be asked about these feedback. And then we want it to answer using only the data given. Important piece of the instruction here is guidelines, where we're telling the assistant that when the user asks for any general feedback information, it must use the collection query node to get the stored feedback. Let's fill out the user prompt. This will be our message to the assistant, and we're going to be sending this value as a query param. So we'll select query, specifically a message field. And now we can move on to the main part of our assistant, which is specifying our collection query tool. For that, we'll select add node, and then we'll search for a collection query. And here we can just select done, and our collection query node is now part of the list of tools that our assistant can use. This collection query node will allow us to easily query data from our BuildShip database. What we need to enter here is our collection name. If you recall, we called our table Google Form Responses. So we can copy the table name and paste it here. That's all the setup we need to do to provide our collection query node as a tool for our OpenAI assistant to use. And the last thing we need to do here is just return the results from our assistant. So for that, we'll just add a return node. And the value we want to return here is the response we get back from our OpenAI assistant. We're now ready to test our workflow. So let's do that. We'll go to test. And remember that we need to send a message to our assistant. And we send that as a query value. The key name is message. And then for the question we want to ask our assistant, we'll say, do we have any negative feedback? Let's test the workflow. It looks like we're running into an error here. Invalid schema for function properties order by. Not really sure what that error is about, but one thing that I know is that we don't need the order by input here. So we can actually have this order by input removed pretty easily by editing this node with AI. To do that, we can select the little one icon at the top. And then we just need to describe how we want to modify the node. So here I'll just say, remove the order by input and generate with AI. And we're all set, easy peasy. Now we can try testing our workflow again. Oops, it looks like we're getting a different error message this time. Value for argument field path is not a valid field path. So let's look at our collection query node. And I have a hunch that the error is probably originating from our filters input. We can look at what value is being passed here. And the problem is that we're passing in a set of placeholder filters, but we don't actually need to pass anything here. So we can just leave it as an empty object. And this time we can test our workflow again, and it should work. And third time's the charm. This time we're getting back a response from our assistant, and it's telling us that yes, we have received some negative feedback from John Doe. His overall feedback for the event was not good. We can see the relevance rating rated 2 out of 5. Satisfaction with the event rated 1 out of 5. Satisfaction with the session Rated 2 out of 5. Great. Our feedback assistant is working just fine. We've just went over in depth how you can connect your Google Forms to BuildShip to create powerful automations over the responses you collect. But there's many more use cases that you can do with the Google Form responses you store in BuildShip. For example, you can send instantaneous notifications to a Discord channel or perform schedule, analysis, and reporting over the responses you get. But we'll leave that next level of exploration up to you. If you found this video interesting, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. If you have any feedback or ideas of what you'd like to see us build next, then please feel free to share them in the comments. That's all for now. Until the next video, happy build shipping.